Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Avoid Common Mistakes when Benchmarking K-12 Schools. We will start in about 5 minutes. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Avoid Common Mistakes when Benchmarking K-12 Schools. We will start in about 1 minute. Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, How to Avoid Common Mistakes when Benchmarking K-12 Schools, and thank you very much for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to run through a couple of housekeeping items. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can submit questions for the Q&A session via the chat box to the host. To access the chat box, hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen and click the bubble icon. A link to a recording of this session and presentation slides will be sent to all registrants after the webinar. That is it for me. I'll pass things over to John to start today's presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll go on to the next slide. So welcome to today's webinar, How to Avoid Common Mistakes When Benchmarking K-12 Schools. Many of these topics may be new for some of you, while being more of a reminder for others, but hopefully you can get some useful tips today, no matter where you are in that process. So we'll start by covering kind of the definition of a K-12 school, get us all on the same page, and then dive into a few other topics here and wrap up with some Q&A at the end. So before we get too far, I want to take some time to go over the basics of a K-12 school property type and set the stage for our upcoming topics. So what is a K-12 school? It may seem self-explanatory, but let's start here. K-12 school buildings or campuses must primarily serve grades K-12. So the school cannot primarily serve any other type of education, including higher education, vocational or trade school, adult school, preschool, pre-K, or daycare. So must primarily serve kindergarten through 12th grades. One of the most common mistakes that arises when benchmarking K-12 schools is not meeting this upfront definition. So at least 75% of all students at the school must be in grades kindergarten through 12th. That means that if the school also serves other students, whether it's preschool, pre-kindergarten, adults, postgraduates, or any other non-K-12 students, they must make up no more than 25% of the total student body. When in doubt, you can check a typical student's schedule, whether they're on campus for the full day, or what percentage of students will receive a high school diploma or GED for high schools to figure out if they are a K-12 student. So now that we've got that covered and defined a K-12 school, what are some other common mistakes? Energy Star requires all buildings serving a K-12 school to be benchmarked together as a campus. When determining if a property is a campus, it's important to take a look at the collection of buildings to see if they function as a whole property as opposed to individual structures. While buildings in a campus are generally owned and operated by the same party, this may not always be the case. It's possible for buildings to be owned and operated separately, but still be required to benchmark together as a campus. Additionally, a property's metering configuration is not a factor in determining whether buildings function as a campus or not. Similarly, with building ownership management and the sharing of HVAC systems, buildings can be separately metered and still be considered a campus. So a good rule of thumb to use to determine if a group of buildings is a campus is to ask if the property's operations would be substantially affected if one building was to be relocated. This is why even for buildings that are owned, operated by separate organizations, if they share amenities, they're still required to benchmark together as a campus. If one of the buildings were to be relocated, students in a building may no longer have access to amenities that they would normally have. So a portable classroom, for instance, would clearly impact students and teachers if it were relocated miles away. However, an administration building located adjacent to a school probably wouldn't have the same impact if it were to be relocated. Another common scenario is when a group of buildings are completed in separate phases, and applicants will benchmark and apply for certification for these different phases separately. While these buildings may be completed and in use at different times, once they are completed and in use, the buildings in both phases function as a single cohesive property. They are operated together, listed together on the same website, share a variety of amenities, etc. Therefore, they can earn certification together and not separately. So a little more on what does it mean to benchmark as a campus. Only 5 property types The 5 property types mentioned above can apply for certification as a campus: hospitals, hotels, K-12 schools, multifamily housing, and senior living communities. Any property type can be benchmarked as a campus if that's what works best for the building owner or manager in terms of tracking, but only these 5 types will be able to earn a score and certify as a campus. In fact, for these 5 property types, if the property consists of multiple buildings, then not only can they certify as a campus, but they must include all owned or managed properties on a single shared site. So you cannot cherry pick individual buildings for certification. You must include all buildings on a campus. And it's a licensed professional's responsibility to make sure they're doing so. It's often helpful for building owners to benchmark and measure the performance of single buildings while also tracking how they contribute to campus-wide performance. So again, you may choose to benchmark both single buildings as well as a multi-building campus simultaneously. That said, child buildings do not need to be added to benchmark the property. So a little more on what that means on the next slide. So this table is meant to help us make a little sense of single versus multiple building setups. So on the left, if your property has a single building, then benchmarking is pretty straightforward. If your property has multiple buildings, you have 2 options. You can benchmark as a single property while making sure you update the gross floor area, GFA, and all the energy use from all buildings on site. If you do so, just make sure to update the building count in Portfolio Manager. And that's listed under Basic Information on the Details tab, and follow that Edit button, and you can scroll down to select more than one building and put in the number. That is the way most K-12 schools certify. On the other hand, alternatively, if you have multiple buildings and they're submetered, for each submetered building, you may benchmark each one separately and add them as child buildings to the main parent property. There's much more detail on this in the How to Benchmark as a Campus guide that is linked here, and you can click on that in the slides that are shared afterwards. So let's take a look at a real-life example. This is a high school campus, and from this image you can see that there are numerous buildings included at the school. The main school building is on the left, just above the parking lot. There's a large performing arts center on top of the image, number 2. And there are 3 buildings supporting athletic facilities on the right. And on the bottom in the parking lot are 14 portable classrooms. So it is required to include the gross floor area and energy use for all of these buildings in the campus property. And as I mentioned, our team checks the number of buildings field under basic property information to verify that all buildings are included in the application. So please be sure to update this field as buildings are either added or removed from the property. So we will pull up a satellite image like this, and if there's only one building listed and we see there's clearly more than one building, that will be a flag for us to follow up on. So let's try a little pop quiz to test our knowledge. A K-12 school has 1 main building, 1 secondary building that only hosts the gymnasium, several storage and landscaping sheds, and 3 separate portable classrooms. Each of these 3 portables are metered separately from the main building. Which of the following structures must be included in the K-12 school's Energy Star certification application? And you have 4 choices here. And then Rosemary, are you able to launch that?
All right, that should be ready to go.
Okay. So I'll give you about a minute here to respond. Are you able to see how our responses are looking, Rosemary?
Yes, so it's looking like We have about 10 people who have not been able to do it yet, but most people have finished, so we can keep it open for maybe 20 more seconds or so.
Okay.
We'll close it down in, all right, 5 more seconds.
Okay.
All right, so you should be able to see the results.
All right. Looks like most people chose C. And that is the correct answer. Well done. All of the buildings must be benchmarked and included. That includes the square footage as well as the energy use for all of these buildings. And again, good guideline is to ask yourself, would the property's operations be affected if one of the buildings were to be relocated? So relocating a portable classroom or gymnasium from the campus would certainly impact significantly the operations of the property. Okay, let's go on to the next one. And we've got another quiz here. This one's a little more nuanced. I'll read it out loud and we'll give everyone about a minute to respond. So this K-12 campus includes a high school and a middle school. The two schools are located in separate buildings and do not share any staff or functions. So they pretty much operate independently. How should this campus be benchmarked? You have 4 options.
We'll go about 30 more seconds. It looks like most people have been able to fill it out. We'll wait a little bit to make sure everyone gets a chance.
Okay.
Okay, another 10 seconds and then I'll close out the poll.
All right, let's see how folks did. So you have a little more of a divided response here. Let's see what the answer is. The answer is actually D. So because they operate independently of each other, they're 2 separate schools, they could be benchmarked either together or separately. It's really up to the property owner and the licensed professional how they want to approach that. And again, that's because they don't share any amenities. Okay, so let's take a dive into another topic here, solar net metering. So if a K-12 school generates on-site green power and consumes all of the green power on site, so no energy is sent back to the grid, the process of benchmarking this energy is pretty straightforward. That said, if energy generated on-site is sent back to the grid, there's some guidelines you need to consider. So on the next slide, we'll go over a diagram of the different energy flows when it comes to solar net metering. Okay, this diagram helps visualize the different flows of energy that would occur from on-site renewable generation. So the energy flows circled in blue are the values that are needed in order to properly benchmark on-site solar. However, many net metering setups do not have access to all 3 of these flows, and you may only have access to the energy flows outlined in the red squares. Just having access to flows R and N will not allow you to benchmark net metered energy correctly. But if you're able to obtain flow RU, REX, or G, in addition to flows R and N, then you'll be able to isolate the required energy flows. So that leads us to common mistake number 3, is reporting a net metered electric grid purchase incorrectly. When benchmarking on-site renewable energy, a common mistake applicants make is benchmarking the net metered electric grid value as opposed to the total energy purchased. So many utilities provide credits to properties for the energy that their on-site system sends back to the grid, and may only provide the total energy purchased minus the energy sent back to the grid in a bill. If this is the case, the applicant will need to work with the utility to obtain the other flows of energy to be able to benchmark electric grid consumption properly. The values entered should capture total energy purchased before any utility credits are applied. And we've got a little quiz here to test that. So I'll read it out loud, and once again, we'll give you about a minute to respond. So we have an example school with on-site solar panels receiving their monthly electric bill. It shows a net electricity consumption value of 120,000 kilowatt hours. That month, the property's solar array generated 40,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, 30,000 of which was being used on site, and 10,000 of which was sent back to the grid. So because the panels generated more energy than the building used and the excess was sent to the grid, the building received a credit for the excess energy on their bill, so the property is net metered. The end question is, what value should be entered in the building's electric grid meter in Portfolio Manager for that month?
A little bit more complicated, so we'll give a few minutes or a couple minutes to fill it out.
We're about a minute in. How are our responses looking, Rosemary?
A little under half of the people have filled it out so far. So we'll wait a little bit longer.
Okay. We got a few more to trickle in.
Yes, we'll wait about 30 more seconds, and we'll close it out.
Okay, we ready? All right, so we've got a few. Yeah, we've got a few different answers selected here. So let's clarify a little bit. The correct answer would have been E, 130,000 kilowatt hours. So net metered solar PV systems can be tricky because the utility won't provide all the information needed to get the values. So in this case, we note the net metered value. So that is the total purchased electricity minus the solar electricity sent from the PV system to the grid is 120,000 kilowatt hours. That's what's on the bill. And then we know 10,000 kilowatt hours were sent from the panels to the grid. So that must mean that the total grid purchase was 130,000 kilowatt hours because they gave a 10,000 kilowatt hour credit back on the bill. Okay. Moving on to the next one here, common mistake number 4 is student occupancy requirements for K-12 schools. So we commonly see schools not meeting the minimum student occupancy threshold, which normally is 8 months. During COVID has been reduced to 6 months. Additionally, it is typically expected that schools run on a standard schedule of 5 days per week with students on campus for the full day. We understand those operations may have changed during COVID-19. Just ask that you document those changes in your application when applying. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And next slide here. So we'll get to apply this in one more pop quiz, and I promise this is the last one today. I'll read the question out loud here. So a K-12 school was operating with in-person education for all students up until mid-March 2020. From mid-March to mid-June, the school was operating, but with 100% virtual education and no students in the facility. From mid-June to mid-August, the school was closed for summer break. From mid-August to the end of November, the school was operating, but with 100% virtual education and no students in the facility. In December 2020, the school began operating with in-person education for half of students. Which of the following period ending dates can be used to earn Energy Star certification for this property? And again, as a reminder, you just need any students in the school. It doesn't have to be 100%. There's a little tip. We have some responses coming in, Rosemary.
Yeah, it's a little low, so we'll probably wait a minute more, and then I'll close it.
Okay.
Go for about 30 more seconds, and I'll close it.
Sounds good.
And I'll close it in 5 more seconds. All right, and you should be able to see the results now.
All right, and most folks chose December 31st, it looks like. But actually, it's any period ending date beginning with May 31st, 2021. And so the reason there is that you need at least 6 months of occupancy, of student occupancy during the 12-month application period. And so students began returning to in-person education during December 2020. 6 months from then would be May 31st. And yeah, subsequently you could use August 31st or September 30th as well. Any of those would be acceptable. Okay. One more item we'll look at here is use details not being updated due to changes in operation from COVID-19. So it's important to capture impacts to operations from COVID-19 in your application. For K-12 schools, there are two fields that are required to be updated: number of workers on main shift and weekend operations. Updates to these fields should be made using the Update with New Information selection in Portfolio Manager and using the correct corresponding date. So make sure you're using the effective date of the change when you make the update and not whatever the day happens to be that you decide to make the update. These time-weighted values will then be applied to your application. And a reminder that Energy Star's definition of number of workers on main shift is the total number of workers present during the primary shift. So this should not be a total count of all workers or full-time equivalents, but rather workers who are present at the same time. So in addition to full-time workers, this should include part-time workers, custodial staff, subcontractors, and volunteers who are present at the same time. Do not include students, teleworkers, visitors, clients, or spectators in that count. And a note on site visits as well. So if your building is not yet fully reoccupied, as long as any portion of the building has occupants, you may conduct the site visit and take measurements in the occupied spaces. If possible, measurements should be taken in occupied spaces while students and workers are present. If that's not possible due to COVID-related precautions, it's acceptable to take the measurements in areas where workers aren't present. Additionally, it is acceptable to take measurements after hours in the occupied spaces as long as the HVAC system is operating normally. During non-COVID times, we also have required that students be present during the site visits. So we just want to make sure these site visits aren't taking place during winter break, summer break, and that we are capturing normal operating conditions. And a quick note too that data from continuous indoor air quality monitoring can be used for IEQ measurements. So that's an important note. So that concludes our presented content on mistakes, and we just have a few reminders here before we get into Q&A. The 2021 label year deadline is coming up December 10th, 2021. And additionally, the 120-day rule to submit applications after the period ending date is currently suspended, but it will be reinstated on January 1st of 2022. And we've got a table below here that shows application processing times will become longer the later in the year that you wait to submit. So, as we experience a surge in volume closer to December 10th and after, it'll just take us longer to turn that back around to you. So the earlier you submit, the faster response you will receive. And with that said, we can dig into questions a little bit. If you haven't already, please submit any questions you have. Jasmine, was there anything you wanted to call out here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for running through all that content, John. We do have a few questions that have come in through the chat. So I'll just kick off with a few that I've seen trickle in. One asks that about a K-12 school, which is in the process of building a new high school that'll be adjacent to a middle school. Specifically in this case, it sounds like students will be able to go from building to building for a shared gym and pool, and teachers don't kind of go between these two buildings to teach, but the maintenance and custodial staff sound like they would. So the question is whether these two schools, the middle school and high school, whether these schools should be treated as separate buildings. And seeing as these two schools share some amenities, such as a gym and a pool, the guidance would likely point to benchmarking these under the same campus property. So a good guideline for determining whether a set of buildings is truly a campus is to ask whether the property's operations would be substantially affected if one of the buildings were to be relocated. So in this case, if one of the two schools were moved 5 miles away, it sounds like the operations of both schools would be impacted, and as a result, it would be best practice to benchmark these buildings under the same campus property. There are cases if there is distinctly submetered energy for both of these buildings. It's kind of up to the discretion of the person doing the benchmarking or the LP to break out these buildings separately instead of benchmarking both buildings under the same larger campus property, if that feels more appropriate, if the operations at some point, become more independent of one another. That could be the best approach as well. But yeah, on the whole, if there are shared amenities and operations would be significantly impacted if one of these buildings were moved far away, the best guidance here is to benchmark both buildings under the same larger campus property. And then we also got a question that did point out a good kind of caveat to including, certain buildings in the larger campus property. So in one of our quiz questions, we'd asked what buildings on a larger campus, in a K-12 campus should be included under the campus property. And one of those buildings we mentioned was, like a shed, like a landscaping shed that was on the campus. And this person had linked an FAQ article about our guidance on whether we should be including like small sheds or trailers or portables under the larger campus property's gross floor area. And there are caveats to that, but I bring up a good point that sheds should be included in the campus property only if these sheds have any amount of energy consumption for heating, cooling, or lighting loads. But if this shed is just kind of like a standalone shed without any energy consumption, their gross floor area should then not be included in the whole property's gross floor area, since the space doesn't contribute at all to the energy metrics for the larger property. So I think the point of this pop quiz question and this question about just like what buildings to include under the larger campus property was just meant to illustrate how all energy consuming buildings, portables that directly relate to the operations of the K-12 property should be included. But there is that caveat in which, like, if there is a space that is just kind of a standalone structure that doesn't use any energy, the total gross floor area of that space shouldn't be included in the larger campus. Great, and then I also saw an additional question that kind of related to the first one we touched on, where this person is asking about a school that has two buildings that also have both of these buildings have their own distinct city building ID, city-specific building ID, and also two distinct addresses. And so the question was whether these buildings should be benchmarked separately as two properties or together under the same property, but reporting different addresses. So the question kind of returns to the guidance for best practices on benchmarking campuses, and that if they have some indivisible operations, it would be best to benchmark them under the same property. Seeing as like in the process of benchmarking, you're asked to identify a distinct like city or local benchmarking ID and also a distinct property address. It might also be in your best interest to follow the steps that were listed in this presentation of like benchmarking first like a parent property, like kind of assigning one of these two buildings as a parent property, and then also creating like a separate child property that is associated to this parent property for which you can like enter individual like address information for both of these buildings, but still like affiliate them under the same umbrella, like or the same like overarching parent properties, that they're still tied together as a campus. So there are certain approaches that you can use, especially when you have different addresses, distinct IDs, so that you can have the best portfolio manager configuration for your multi-building campus.
Thanks, Jasmine. I see
Yeah.
another one here that I think I can go back to. Someone was asking why you wouldn't include the solar power generated for use on site and not sent back to the grid. And I can go back to the question to help clarify. So this is the one. And to clarify, that should be included. But the question we were asking was specific to the grid electric meter and how to account for that on the grid meter. Separately, you should be entering a solar energy meter for the facility as well. And for that meter, you'll have energy generated and consumed on site in one column, and then energy generated and sent off site in another column. And so just make sure you're properly accounting for those two columns in addition to the grid electricity column. Those all kind of interact with each other on a net metered electric bill, as we talked about.
Yeah, definitely. And we also saw a few kind of related questions about school buildings with like solar PV systems, whether that would positively impact the Energy Star score. So I guess like compared to an identical building with no PV, no solar PV. And the answer is yes. Having on-site solar that is also used on-site to, power a lot of the building's energy consumption and usage definitely does positively impact the Energy Star score, as having on-site renewables makes for a lower source to site ratio due to basically like a one-to-one transmission loss rate, and that there is no transmission. There is no energy loss in the process of getting energy from the grid to use on site. So as such, the Energy Star scoring model does account for those efficiencies when there are on-site solar and wind systems for a K-12 property or any other property.
Thanks, Jasmine. I'm seeing the next one here. The number of months in the occupancy pool will be clarified. May 31st, 2021 would appear to have only 5 months. So let me go back to that question here. Okay, so here we are. And yeah, so because students began to reoccupy the school in December of 2020, if you just go 6 months out from there, because 6 months is under COVID, the new rule for occupancy is 6 months, not 8 months of student occupancy, and any number of students. Because they began to return to in-person education, 6 months out from December 2020 would be May 31st, 2021, would be the earliest period ending date. And I see, assuming summer break in 2021, yeah, I mean, it would depend on when summer break begins for the school. I think many schools do go into May, but it's possible some may not. So you should be accounting for summer break as well. And then we see another one here. For a multi-building campus, is it possible or preferable to benchmark each building individually and then tag them all as belonging to one campus if seeking certification? So yes, that is definitely possible. We didn't go too in-depth into that approach in here, but I did reference there's a how to benchmark as a campus guide that discusses that approach in much more detail. And it's highlighted here and hyperlinked in the slide. So you can also find this if you Google search Energy Star how to benchmark as a campus. But it will give you much more detail on how to do that. And you can select one main parent property as well as child properties underneath it and benchmark each building separately. And you can apply for certification that way, although I'll note that most schools do not apply for certification that way. They usually apply as a single building, and then as noted in the screenshots here, they'll just update the number of buildings belonging to that property, but just benchmark as a single cohesive property.
Yep, great point. I'm going to return really quickly to the discussion about having an on-site solar PV system and how that improved the Energy Star rating. So a follow-up question came in asking if it drops a building's source EUI and on-site EUI. And yes, so like the inclusion of on-site solar would kind of improve the building source EUI metrics, which is also the metric that the Energy Star score is based off of. Source EUI is seen as kind of like a more representative way of measuring a building's energy use, since with all the different fuel types available in Portfolio Manager, there are different like transmission rates and losses for each of these fuel types. So those are all kind of like factored into the scoring model and best represented by the source EUI. So that is, yes, the best way to interpret how on-site solar might improve your Energy Star score. And then there's also a question here that asks, is Energy Star certification required for private preschool to 8th grade schools? And something to clarify about the certification program is that it's not required for any property type. It might be, part of a state or local benchmarking legislation to, like encourage buildings to perform above a certain standard. But the Energy Star certification program is available to properties that have an Energy Star score of 75 or higher, which puts them at above, 75% of comparable peer buildings. So it is a recognition program and recognizes buildings that perform above average or well above average. And I guess another thing to speak to about this question is it specifies a private preschool to 8th grade school. And this also ties back to our discussion earlier in the presentation about the definition of a K-12 school, which is also something that is verified during the application process for Energy Star certification. So as long as, and I believe there is a slide on this towards the beginning of the presentation, I can find this, I think it might be.
Which one are you looking for, Jasmine?
Slide 5, yeah. So yeah, slide 5 has this like definition of a K through 12 school as having to, yep, there it is. As like the student body has to be comprised of at least 75% students in the grades kindergarten through 12th grade. So that if there is like a preschool contingency, there might also be, it would be in your best interest to like specify how much of your student body is comprised of preschool students. And that might also come up in like the review process of your application if you do mention that there are preschoolers in your property. But as long as that number is like less than 25% of your larger student body, it should still be eligible for the K through 12 school definition and property type classification.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. So there was another question about the net metered solar electricity. And I think, again, what's causing confusion is here that this is just referring to the electric grid meter and not the solar meter itself. So, you know, maybe in a future iteration here we put in the solar meter as well to help clarify, but yes, they're confused that the 30,000 kilowatt hours from the solar meter is not being included, but this school would have to have a separate solar meter set up as well, and including that 30,000 kilowatt hours being consumed on site, and noting the 10,000 kilowatt hours exported off site. And again, this is just the electric grid meter should have that 10,000 that was exported off site added to the grid meter because it was a credit that was applied and therefore subtracted from the grid meter. And I do see this one sounds unique, but are there any common pitfalls for benchmarking schools that are only part of a larger building? For example, schools operating within part of an old strip mall. I can't say I know of any common pitfalls. I'm sure there's some pitfalls. Yeah, Jasmine, have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an interesting scenario as far as like defining. It could be related to some discussions in other trainings that we have about like mixed use properties and you know, benchmarking any type of property that in a building that shares like other uses. So in this case, you know, I haven't personally seen too many instances of like a K-12 school sharing a property use with, or sharing a building with another property use, such as like a mall. But it certainly is possible, and we do have some existing guidance in our very large FAQ database about best practices for benchmarking mixed use properties and also like minimum I guess eligibility rules for like how the configuration of your building should be if you're looking to certify this building for Energy Star certification, which we can also link and connect with this person offline about.
Yeah, just one thing that comes to mind right away for me is, you know, sub-metering and what does the metering setup look like? Hopefully that school would be completely sub-metering, you'd be able to isolate that energy, but that could obviously be a pitfall right there. And I think that's all we have. If you have any last questions, feel free to submit them. We can hang on for another minute or so. But otherwise, I think we're out of questions.
And I haven't gotten any more in the chat yet.
Okay. And yeah, it looks like one attendee did note, so, you know, solar electricity or on-site generation would drop a building source UI, but not site UI, and that's exactly correct, right? So the source site factor plays a role in improving the efficiency of the building just from generating and using on-site energy rather than grid electricity. All right, with that note, I think we can give everyone 11 minutes back on their day. So thank you for attending, and we'll share the slides. Have a great afternoon.